In the winter of 1946, a woman in Warsaw named Marta kept something behind a loose brick in her kitchen wall. Not cash, not jewelry, not documents. A small amount of gold, perhaps 30 grams, that her grandmother had pressed into her hands in 1939, the week before the German occupation began. The grandmother said almost nothing, just, "Don't put it in a bank. Don't tell anyone. Don't let it touch paper." Marta survived the occupation. The Soviet transition. The post-war currency resets. The centralization of Polish assets under communist authority. 4 separate instances where the government redefined what citizens were legally permitted to own. Through all of it, the brick in the kitchen wall stayed. Not because she was wealthy, not because she was clever, but because her grandmother had understood something structural, something that hadn't changed across every decade of chaos that followed. Some things, placed correctly, simply cannot be reached. That observation sounds simple, almost obvious. But the mechanism behind it is neither simple nor obvious, and understanding it changes how you read 5 centuries of financial history. Because there is a pattern, quiet, consistent, almost never discussed in formal economic education, that surfaces every time a monetary system comes under serious pressure, not in the headlines, not in the policy papers, but in what actually survived, what families still held on the other side, what central banks quietly maintained when they thought no one was paying close attention. The pattern isn't about any particular asset, it's about a structural quality that certain assets carry, a quality that makes them resistant, not by legal protection, not by luck, but by their nature, by what they fundamentally are. Most people look at financial crises and see the things that failed, the currencies that collapsed, the banks that closed, the savings that evaporated. A smaller group asks the opposite question: what didn't fail, and why? Think about the last major monetary disruption you know anything about. It might be 2008, it might be Argentina in 2001, it might be something further back, Weimar, Budapest, the French assignat collapse of the 1790s. In every one of those events, governments did what governments do under pressure. They reached, they legislated, they redefined the rules of ownership in ways that would have seemed impossible the year before. And in doing so, they revealed something, not about their intentions, but about the structural limits of institutional power. Because governments can do a great deal, but they cannot do everything, and the gap between what they can theoretically control and what they can practically reach, that gap has, historically, been the space where certain kinds of wealth survived intact. You may not have thought about that gap before. Most people haven't. But it exists. It has always existed. And understanding it clearly is what this video is actually about. This video examines the documented historical behavior of wealth across 5 centuries of monetary disruption. Not theory, not predictions, only patterns drawn from what actually happened. What governments did, what assets survived, and what structural characteristics those surviving assets shared. To navigate this clearly, it helps to think in 3 categories. First, paper claims. Promises made by institutions, banks, governments, pension systems to deliver value at a future point, useful and stable conditions, structurally exposed when the issuing institution comes under pressure. Second, regulated hard assets, physical things with real value, real estate, commodities, business equity that exist inside a legal framework. Governments can tax them, seize them, restrict their use, or redefine what ownership means. Their value is real. Their accessibility is conditional. Third, structurally resistant assets, a narrower category. Things whose value doesn't depend on any issuer's promise, whose physical or legal nature makes confiscation difficult in practice, and which have consistently retained function across the worst monetary transitions in recorded history. It is this third category that history keeps quietly pointing toward. Begin in France, 1790. The revolutionary government, desperate to fund the new republic and stabilize a collapsing treasury, issued what they called the assignat, a paper currency backed by the value of seized church and noble lands. The theory was elegant. The land was real. The paper represented claims on that land. It should have held value. It didn't. Within 4 years, the assignat had lost more than 90% of its face value. The government printed more, then more again, By 1796, the currency was functionally worthless, and the government abolished it entirely, printing a new currency and beginning again. What happened to those who had stored savings in assignats? Erased. What happened to those who had quietly maintained holdings in actual productive land, not paper claims on land, but land itself, worked and generating output across distributed rural provinces? They came through, not unscathed, but functional. The land still produced. The crops didn't respond to the government's monetary decisions. The productive capacity of the soil existed entirely independently of the government's ability to maintain its promise. The paper representation of value collapsed. The underlying value, embedded in physical productive capacity, did not. Move forward to Germany, 1921 to 1923. The Weimar hyperinflation is well documented. Prices doubling by the hour, wheelbarrows of notes to buy bread. Bank savings, government bonds, insurance policies, reduced to something close to nothing. But embedded in that catastrophe is a less discussed structural observation. Hugo Stinnes, a German industrialist, had spent the years before the collapse borrowing heavily in marks to acquire physical productive assets, coal operations, steel plants, shipping companies. When the mark collapsed, his debts, denominated in that collapsing currency, became nearly worthless to service. But his assets kept producing. He emerged from the crisis as one of the wealthiest individuals in Europe. This wasn't genius. It was structural logic. He held the function, not merely the representation of the function. And when the representation failed, the function remained. What's equally notable is what the government could not efficiently do. It could issue emergency decrees. It could redenominate currency, but it could not enumerate and confiscate widely distributed physical productive assets across an entire economy in active chaos. The enforcement infrastructure doesn't operate at that scale under those conditions. Scale, distribution, physical embeddedness, these qualities kept reappearing. Hungary, 1944 through 1946, the worst hyperinflation in recorded human history. Prices doubling on average every 15 hours at the peak. The government eventually issued a denomination called the Milliardbilpengen. The number has no common name in English. It doesn't need one. It was the symbol of a monetary system in total failure. In that environment, a parallel barter economy emerged alongside the collapsing official one. What held value in that parallel system wasn't listed in any registry or tracked in any formal account. It was tools, seeds, building materials, skills, the capacity to produce something another person needed. Small, productive land, physical objects whose utility existed entirely outside the monetary system's reach. This reveals something fundamental about the nature of state power. It operates through systems, enforcement systems, information systems, legal systems, and those systems have capacity limits. A government consumed by monetary collapse has limited bandwidth to track what a farmer stores in a shed or what a craftsman carries in a wooden box. Systems fail quietly before they fail visibly, and when enforcement systems are strained, the gap between theoretical reach and practical reach widens considerably. Now 1971. Quieter, more structural. In August of that year, President Nixon closed the gold window, ending the Bretton Woods Agreement and severing the last formal link between the dominant global currency and a physically constrained commodity. From that point forward, every major currency in the world was a fully managed promise, backed not by something finite, but by institutional credibility and collective confidence. The transition was smooth. There were no breadlines, no immediate visible crisis, which is precisely why most people missed what had fundamentally changed. In the decades that followed, certain institutions, central banks with long organizational memory, family offices that had survived multiple currency transitions, endowments managing assets across centuries, quietly maintained allocations in things that looked, to outside observers, unnecessarily conservative. Physical gold, productive land across multiple jurisdictions, assets generating output independent of any single currency's stability. These weren't emotional decisions, they were structural ones. These institutions had memory of what happened when the promise failed. They structured themselves so that if it happened again, they would retain function. That is a different kind of thinking than most financial education produces. By now, the pattern has become visible. It isn't simply that hard assets beat paper assets in crises. That's a surface reading. The deeper structure is about the relationship between state reach and asset design. What the historical record consistently shows is this: assets that are physically non-reproducible, jurisdictionally distributed, and functionally independent of institutional intermediaries have repeatedly resisted state reach, not because governments lacked the will, but because the structural cost of reaching them exceeded practical capacity. 3 characteristics. Across 5 centuries. Across different cultures, different governments, different monetary systems. Physical non-reproducibility. Jurisdictional distribution. Functional independence. Value doesn't disappear during a monetary crisis. It moves. It moves toward things with these characteristics and away from things without them. Not because of fear or speculation. Because of a structural logic that has been operating quietly for a very long time. Here's what's worth sitting with. Looking at the cases we've examined: France in the 1790s, Weimar Germany, Budapest in 1946, the post-1971 monetary architecture, which of those 3 structural characteristics feels most absent from how most people currently store value? Not as a prediction, simply as an observation about structure. If something here changed how you think about asset design versus asset accumulation, I'd genuinely like to know which part landed. And if you see the historical pattern differently, if there are cases that complicate this reading, bring them into the comments. No single interpretation captures everything. The conversation around it is where real understanding builds. There's a kind of knowledge that no currency reset, no policy change, no market correction can confiscate. The knowledge of how systems actually behave under pressure. What survives, what moves, what governments can practically reach versus what they can only theoretically claim. Marta's grandmother understood this without a framework, without terminology, without a documentary to explain it. She understood it because she had watched a system reach for everything and seen, with her own eyes, precisely where its hands fell short. That understanding travels across generations, not through banks, not through institutions, through attention to what actually happened, and the quiet discipline to structure accordingly. The pattern is older than any government currently operating, and it hasn't finished teaching.